In the vast expanse of the Andromeda galaxy, there exists a warrior race so incredibly full of themselves that they make reality TV stars look humble. These are the Craxan warriors, self-proclaimed masters of strategic brilliance and galactic conquest. Now, when I say strategic brilliance, I mean they once declared victory over an uninhabited planet, because none of its rocks fought back. The Craxan battle records, kept in their great hall of almost victories, tell tales of their numerous attempts to conquer various worlds. There was the time they tried to invade the ice planet Frozone, only to discover their weapons couldn't penetrate the atmosphere because they'd forgotten to pack the de-icer. Then there was the embarrassing incident on Jungle World 4, where their entire army retreated after encountering what they thought was a fearsome beast, but turned out to be a particularly grumpy space hamster. Commander Blorp, the latest in a long line of increasingly desperate Craxan leaders, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Inevitable Victory. The ship had been named by his predecessor, who clearly had a better grasp of irony than actual military strategy. Blorp's 3 tentacles nervously adjusted his ceremonial armor, which was covered in so many medals that he occasionally tipped over during important speeches. "Lieutenant Squish," Blorp called out to his second-in-command, who was currently trying to untangle himself from his control panel. "Show me our next target." Squish, who had finally freed 6 of his 8 appendages, pulled up a holographic display of a small blue planet. This, O magnificent commander of occasionally successful missions, is a backwater world called Earth. Our preliminary scans show it's primarily inhabited by beings who spend most of their time staring at small rectangular devices and arguing about something called pineapple on pizza. Blorp's eye stalks perked up with interest. Primitive technology? No unified planetary defense? This could be it, Squish. This could finally be our chance to prove that the Craxan warriors are more than just the galaxy's longest-running military blooper reel. The commander waddled closer to the hologram, his medals jingling like a one-man band having a seizure. What are their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, their most precious resources? Squish consulted his data pad, which was actually just a very shiny piece of metal he used to look busy. Well, sir, they appear to be completely dependent on something called caffeine. They voluntarily poison themselves with processed sugar, and they regularly torture themselves in special buildings called gyms. Excellent. A species that willingly undermines its own strength and their defensive capabilities. They seem to put a lot of faith in something called middle management, sir. Blorp's face tentacles curled into what passed for a smile among his species. At last, we've found it. A civilization so fundamentally flawed that even we can't possibly fail to conquer it. He paused dramatically, waiting for the background music that usually accompanied such moments, before remembering they'd had to cut the ship's orchestra due to budget constraints. "Prepare the fleet, alert all warriors, set course for Earth," Blorp declared, raising all 3 arms triumphantly. Unfortunately, the weight of his medals finally won their long-time battle with gravity, and he toppled forward onto the command console, accidentally activating the ship's windshield wipers. As the fleet of Craxan warships turned toward Earth, nobody noticed the small warning label that flashed briefly across their screens. "Warning. Planet contains unpredictable small humans. Approach with extreme caution." But then again, the Craxans had never been very good at reading warning labels. They were about to learn why that was a serious mistake. The Craxan research team, composed of the finest minds their severely limited education budget could produce, began their analysis of Earth with all the precision of a blindfolded juggler. Their lead researcher, Dr. Fizzbang, had earned his credentials by successfully identifying his own species in a lineup, only 3 tries. "Commander Blorp," Fizzbang announced, his tentacles excitedly tangled in his datapad, "we've identified the perfect weak point in human defenses. They have these smaller versions of themselves which they call children, who appear to be completely useless in combat." Blorp leaned forward, nearly impaling himself on his medals. "Explain." "These miniature humans spend most of their time engaging in absolutely non-tactical activities. They chase bubbles, color outside designated lines, and occasionally eat substances clearly labelled as non-edible. But most importantly, Fizbang paused for dramatic effect, accidentally drooling on his control panel. They regularly enter a state of complete unconsciousness called napping. Lieutenant Squish, who had finally untangled himself from yesterday's predicament only to get stuck in a new one, raised a tentacle. "But sir, surely their adult units protect these vulnerable offspring." "Ah!" Fizbang wobbled excitedly. "That's the brilliant part. The adult humans actually enforce these periods of defenselessness. They create special darkened rooms and demand silence during these nap times. It's like they're gift-wrapping their weaknesses for us." The research team had focused their attention on a particular test subject, Tommy Anderson, age 4, resident of 42 Maple Drive in suburban America. Their surveillance drones, disguised as particularly stupid-looking pigeons, had been monitoring his habits for days. "Observe the specimen's routine," Fizbang continued, pulling up footage of a small human boy who seemed to operate on only 2 settings, full throttle and completely unconscious. Every day at 1400 hours Earth time, the primary caregiver unit, designation Mum, initiates the napping protocol. The footage showed Jessica Anderson, a woman who had mastered the art of typing emails with one hand while preventing household disasters with the other, executing what the Craxons would later describe in their reports as a tactical masterpiece of child management. "Notice how she times his energy expenditure perfectly," Fizbang noted with academic interest. "A morning of activities, followed by lunch, then a strategic viewing of something called Bluey, leading directly into nap time. The precision is remarkable." What the Craxons failed to understand, because their species had evolved from a particularly dense form of space coral, was the warning signs scattered throughout their own surveillance footage. They dismissed the way other humans scattered at the sound of a tired toddler's whine. They ignored the knowing looks exchanged between parents at the playground when someone mentioned skipping nap time. And most fatally, they completely misinterpreted Jessica's constant mantra of "Don't you dare wake him up or I swear to God." Commander Blorp studied the data with all the comprehension of a goldfish trying to understand quantum physics. So, during these nap periods, the tiny humans are completely vulnerable. "Absolutely defenseless," Fizbang confirmed, conveniently missing several warning labels in his own data about Category 5 tantrums and the nap-time apocalypse protocols. "And the location of these napping chambers, they're not heavily fortified?" "Just some primitive wooden structures, sir, although—" Fizbang squinted at his notes. "There are these strange force field devices they call baby monitors that seem to serve some warning purpose." Blorp's face tentacles curled into what he thought was an evil smile, but looked more like he'd just smelled something unfortunate. "Then we have found our point of attack. We shall strike during this nap time, when their defences are lowest and their tiny warriors are unconscious." As the Craxon fleet prepared their invasion plan, focusing on the suburban battlefield of Maple Drive, they remained blissfully unaware of the fundamental law of human parenting they were about to violate. Throughout the galaxy, more advanced species had long ago added a crucial warning to their databases. Never under any circumstances wake a human child from their nap. The Craxons were about to learn this lesson the hard way. Operation Naptime Strike began at precisely 14:27 Earth hours, exactly 12 minutes after Jessica Anderson had finally gotten Tommy to fall asleep. This timing was, as the Craxons would later record in their book of catastrophic mistakes, spectacularly poor, as it hadn't given the child time to enter deep sleep. Captain Zit, leader of the ground assault team and unfortunate future holder of the title, "He Who Learned Why We Don't Wake Tiny Humans," was positioning his warriors around the Anderson household. They moved with all the stealth of a tap-dancing elephant in bubble wrap. "Sir," whispered one of his soldiers, somehow managing to trip over absolutely nothing, "the primitive detection device is making noise." He pointed at the baby monitor, which was picking up their movement. In the kitchen, Jessica paused in the middle of finally enjoying her first sip of still-hot coffee. She cocked her head, listening to the strange sounds coming through the monitor. Her mum radar, honed by 4 years of preventing Tommy-related disasters, was pinging like crazy. Meanwhile, Commander Blorp was monitoring the situation from his flagship, which was poorly disguised as a particularly large and metallic cloud. "Report, Captain Zit. What's the status of the tiny human?" "Confirmation through the viewing portal, sir," Zizit replied, his face pressed against Tommy's bedroom window. The small one appears to be in standard sleep mode. He's clutching some kind of stuffed warrior beast. I believe they call it Mr. Snuggles. "Excellent. Proceed with extraction. Remember, according to our research, human offspring are completely harmless during nap phases." At this exact moment, had the Kraxans possessed any kind of actual research capabilities, they would have discovered that their database had a rather important footnote about human children. "Warning, sleep status does not diminish threat level. In fact, premature sleep termination may result in catastrophic consequences." Jessica was now standing at the bottom of the stairs, every maternal instinct screaming. She'd seen the shadows moving past the windows, heard the strange whirring sounds. Any other day, she might have been concerned about aliens, but right now she had only one thought: if they wake him up. Captain Zizit, demonstrating the famous Kraxan ability to make the worst possible decision at any given moment, decided that the most efficient way to capture the sleeping human child would be to simply teleport him directly to their ship. Unfortunately, their teleporter had been purchased from Discount Dave's used spacecraft emporium and had all the reliability of a chocolate teapot. The beam engaged with a sound like 1,000 wind chimes in a blender. It completely missed Tommy, but did succeed in knocking over his nightlight, bumping his bed, and most catastrophically, causing Mr. Snuggles to fall to the floor. Tommy stirred. In the kitchen, Jessica's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. Every parent within a 5-block radius suddenly felt a disturbance in the force. Sir?" One of Zet's soldiers backed away from the window. "The tiny human's eyes are opening." "Excellent," Commander Blorp's voice crackled over the comm. "Now we can begin negotiations for Earth's surrender." Tommy sat up in bed, his eyes focused on Mr. Snuggles lying face down on the floor. His lower lip began to quiver. Captain Zert, suddenly feeling like he'd made a series of poor life choices, watched as the small human's face scrunched up in a way that made his survival instinct start screaming in languages he didn't even know he knew. "Sir," he transmitted to Commander Blorp, his voice shaking, "I'm beginning to think we may have miscalculated." He never finished that sentence, because at that precise moment, Tommy Anderson, age 4, prematurely awakened from his nap and separated from Mr. Snuggles, did what any reasonable toddler would do. He took a deep breath. Jessica, already halfway up the stairs, muttered what would later become the official subtitle in the galactic records of this incident. "Oh, you poor, stupid aliens. You really shouldn't have done that." The scream that followed would be remembered in Kraxan history as the sound that launched 1,000 retreats. The first wave of Tommy's tantrum hit the Kraxan warriors with the force of a supernova. Captain Zudst, who had faced down plasma storms and survived 3 different space Kraken attacks, found himself launched backward by nothing more than sound waves and pure unleashed toddler rage. "Want Mr. Snuggles?" The scream shattered every window in the Anderson house. 3 nearby car alarms started wailing in sympathy, and somewhere in the galaxy, a peaceful race of beings evolved specifically to cover their ears. "Status report," Commander Blorp demanded from his flagship, which was now vibrating in a way that expensive spaceships really shouldn't. "What weapon is the tiny human deploying?" Captain Zeet, currently trying to untangle himself from a rosebush he'd been blown into, could only transmit back sounds that could generously be described as whimpering. His soldiers, trained warriors of the mighty Kraxan fleet, were scattered across the Andersons' front lawn in various states of panic and confusion. Inside the house, Jessica calmly stepped over 2 stunned alien invaders on her way to Tommy's room. She'd seen this coming from the moment she heard the first suspicious noise on the baby monitor. This wasn't her first interrupted nap rodeo. Tommy had now achieved what pediatric experts refer to as full nuclear meltdown status. His face had turned a shade of red, previously unknown to science, and tears were literally defying gravity. The Craxon's sensitive scanning equipment was registering energy readings that made their previous encounters with actual supernovas look like birthday candles. The small human appears to be utilizing some form of sonic warfare, Lieutenant Squish reported from the ship, reading displays that were cracking under the acoustic assault. And sir, I believe he's just getting started. He was right. Tommy slid off his bed, his tiny feet hitting the floor with all the impact of a miniature Godzilla. The resulting stomp sent shockwaves through the ground that registered on seismographs 3 states away. Scientists would later classify it as a magnitude 5.7 on the toddler scale. I want my blankie, I want juice, I'm not tired. Each demand came with its own unique frequency of rage, systematically shorting out different systems in the Craxon fleet. Their highly advanced technology, capable of surviving solar flares and asteroid impacts, proved remarkably vulnerable to the specific pitch of a cranky 4-year-old. Commander Blorp watched in horror as his ship's systems began failing one by one. How is this possible? Our shields are calibrated to withstand the most powerful energy weapons in the galaxy. Sir, Squish replied, frantically trying to keep the ship's core from going critical, I don't think they were calibrated for whatever that is. He pointed at their view screen, which showed Tommy, now in full sprint down the hallway, leaving a trail of destruction that would make a tornado feel professionally inadequate. The Craxon ground forces were in full retreat, Captain Zed, having finally extracted himself from the rosebush, only to be knocked into Mrs. Peterson's prized petunias by another sound wave, was attempting to restore some kind of order. Tactical retreat, tactical retreat. One of his soldiers sprinting past shouted back, There's nothing tactical about this, sir. This is just retreat. Jessica, meanwhile, had reached Tommy's room. She surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a veteran parent. One overturned nightlight, one floor-bound Mr. Snuggles, and about a dozen alien invaders visible through the broken window, all running around her front yard like headless space chickens. She picked up Mr. Snuggles, dusted him off, and sighed. You boys really didn't read the manual on this one, did you? Tommy rounded the corner back into his room, face still set to maximum rage, just as Commander Blorp made his final mistake of the day. The Craxon leader, desperate to salvage something from this catastrophe, activated the ship's external speakers. Attention, tiny human, this is Commander Blorp of the Craxon Empire. We demand your immediate He never finished that sentence, because that's when Tommy, overtired and now faced with a loud noise interrupting his demands for juice, decided to demonstrate why inside voice is a concept that only applies when a toddler feels like it. The scream that followed would later be used in the Galactic Museum of Military History as an example of why proper reconnaissance should always include checking nap time schedules. Commander Blorp's ill-advised announcement had the same effect as poking a sleeping bear with a kazoo. Tommy's response created what meteorologists would later classify as the first recorded instance of a Category 5 tantrum cane. The sound that erupted from Tommy's tiny but impossibly powerful lungs created a new entry in the Galactic Encyclopedia, Toddler Rage Wave, a phenomenon capable of disrupting electronic equipment, causing spontaneous system failures and making even the most hardened warrior wish their species had never evolved ears. On the Craxon flagship, chaos reigned supreme. Control panels sparked, navigation systems went haywire, and the ship's artificial intelligence requested immediate early retirement. Lieutenant Squish, watching multiple systems fail simultaneously, made a mental note to update his resume, assuming they survived. Sir, Squish reported, his voice cracking like a teenager's, the small human's power levels are still increasing. He's somehow generating more energy than a dying star, and he's doing it while demanding chicken nuggets. Commander Blorp, who had been thrown across the bridge by the latest sound wave, attempted to maintain some dignity while hanging upside down from a ceiling fixture. How? How is this possible? We are the mighty Craxon Empire. We cannot be defeated by a tiny human throwing a temper tantrum. The universe, with its infinite wisdom and impeccable comedic timing, chose that moment to prove him spectacularly wrong. Down on Earth, Jessica had seen enough. With the practiced calm of someone who had weathered countless toddler storms, she implemented what the Craxons would later study as the Anderson Protocol. "Tommy," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with maternal precision, "look who I found." Tommy's next scream caught in his throat as he spotted Mr. Snuggles in his mum's hands. The sudden silence was so jarring that several Craxon warriors who had been running in circles on the front lawn crashed into each other. But Jessica wasn't done. Like a hostage negotiator dealing with an extremely unreasonable tiny terrorist, she played her next card. "And you know what? I think it's time for—" She reached behind her back and pulled out Tommy's emergency juice box. The change in Tommy's demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying in its own way. His face, which had invented 3 new shades of red during his tantrum, suddenly transformed into what the Craxons would describe in their reports as an expression of angelic innocence that cannot possibly belong to the same being we just witnessed. "Juice?" Tommy asked, his voice now sweet enough to cause dental cavities. Across the neighborhood, other parents who had been listening to the chaos through their own baby monitors nodded in appreciation of Jessica's technique. Mrs. Peterson, watching from her window as shell-shocked alien warriors untangled themselves from her flower beds, made a mental note to ask Jessica which brand of juice boxes she used for crisis intervention. Commander Blorp, who had finally managed to right himself, watched the scene through the ship's remaining functional camera with a mixture of awe and horror. It's like watching a supernova turn into a kitten. How did she do that?" Lieutenant Squish, who had actually read some of their cultural research files, whispered reverently. "They call them mom powers." The remaining Craxon ground forces, including a thoroughly traumatized Captain Zit, watched in stunned silence as Jessica executed the rest of her standard naptime recovery protocol. They observed as she retrieved the blankie, which had somehow ended up on the ceiling fan, adjusted the room temperature to optimal napping conditions, began humming something called a lullaby that made several hardened warriors feel unexpectedly sleepy. "Sir," Captain Ziz transmitted to Commander Blorp, his voice shaking, "I believe we may have severely underestimated everything, literally everything about this situation." As Tommy began to calm down, sipping his juice while cuddling Mr. Snuggles, the Craxons received their final shock of the day. Other humans had begun emerging from their houses, more parents, all armed with juice boxes, stuffed animals, and knowing looks that said, "First time dealing with an interrupted nap, huh?" Commander Blorp, watching this gathering force of experienced parents, made what was perhaps his first wise decision of the day. "All forces," he announced, trying to keep the terror out of his voice, "prepare for immediate retreat, and someone please update our tactical databases with a warning about nap time. A very, very big warning." The Great Naptime Incident, as it would come to be known in galactic history, ended not with a bang, but with a sippy cup. The Craxon retreat was so hasty that several warriors left equipment behind, including what appeared to be the alien equivalent of a dash cam, which would later become the neighborhood's most popular source of entertainment at block parties. Commander Blorp's official report to the Craxon High Command set a new record for creative use of emergency warning symbols. It read, in part, "Urgent advisory, Earth to be classified as extreme hazard, particularly during designated rest periods known as nap time. Have adjusted our threat classification system to include new category, toddler, crimson alert." The report went on to recommend several policy changes. All future invasion plans must include consultation of target species napping schedules. Standard issue equipment to now include stuffed animals and juice boxes for emergency negotiations. Immediate development of sonic shielding calibrated specifically for toddler frequencies. Mandatory viewing of Bluey for all tactical officers to better understand Earth's tiny terrorists. Lieutenant Squish, who had somehow emerged as the voice of reason in this catastrophe, added his own addendum. "Perhaps we should consider invading uninhabited planets only. like Gary did that one time. Gary might have been onto something. Back on Earth, Jessica Anderson stood in Tommy's room surveying the aftermath. The windows would need replacing, the garden would need replanting, and Mrs. Peterson's petunias had suffered casualties that no insurance policy would ever believe. But Tommy was finally, blessedly, back asleep. The neighborhood watch meeting that evening was particularly interesting. As Jessica sipped her finally reheated coffee, her neighbors shared their various perspectives on the afternoon's excitement. "Did you see the one that got tangled in the tire swing? Spun himself right into another dimension, I reckon," chuckled Mr. Johnson from 2 doors down. "I got the whole thing on my Ring camera," Mrs. Mitchell announced proudly. "Already gone viral on 3 planets." The clip would indeed become famous across the galaxy, usually shared with the caption, "This is why you don't mess with nap time." Several advanced civilizations added it to their mandatory diplomatic training. Captain Zizit, meanwhile, had submitted his immediate resignation and opened a successful chain of daycare centers specializing in nap protocol consultation. His signature course, Why That Warning Sign Actually Means What It Says, became required reading for all aspiring planetary invaders. The Kraxon Empire did eventually revise their invasion strategies. Their new manual opened with a simple but effective warning system. Level 1, Standard Planetary Hazards. Level 2, Extreme Environmental Dangers. Level 3, Tommy. As for Tommy himself, he remembered nothing of the incident, which was probably for the best. The only lasting evidence of the invasion was a strange new habit. Whenever he got particularly cranky, his mum would smile and ask, "Should we call the aliens?" It always made him giggle, though he never knew why. Jessica did make one small change to her routine. She added a sign to their front door, written in both English and Universal Galactic Standard. "Nap time in progress, disturb at your own risk. And yes, this means you alien invaders, we don't need another incident. P.S. The Petersons' petunias are still recovering." Somewhere in the vast expanse of space, Commander Blorp's final log entry summed up the lesson learned that day. "Note to all future commanders, when a human mother says, 'Don't wake the baby,' this is not a suggestion, this is not a guideline, this is the difference between a successful mission and having your entire fleet reconsider their career choices while hiding in a rosebush." And so the legend of the Great Naptime Incident became a cautionary tale told across the galaxy. Some say that even now, on quiet days, you can still hear the echo of Tommy's tantrum bouncing between distant stars, reminding all potential invaders of the cardinal rule of Earth conquest. Never ever under any circumstances mess with nap time.